Okay, why don't we start with a word of prayer and then let's just get to work because there's a lot to cover. Lord, please help us as we grapple with the absurdity of life and try to understand what this book has to say to us. Help us to not try to judge the speaker, but to step back and just listen to their complaint and to hear what they have to say about the way that the world works. But help us also to see that there's wisdom in what they're saying and that it can be valuable to our lives. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Amen. Okay, so let's start out. So we're going to try to tackle the first two chapters this week. And I'm going to be organizing because we've only got 5 meetings of this study until we kind of run out of time right before Christmas. And try to break up. Some weeks we're going to do 3 chapters, some weeks we'll do 2. It just depends on the length of the chapters and also the content, because there are some chapters that are very interesting and dense with a lot to unpack in them. And some chapters are like, oh, let's just sort of use like Proverbs. And you sort of, there's not as much to say about those. So I want to start by saying that if I remember right, the mission fair is next week. He says, looking at his pastor, yep. The mission and at one of the mission share committee members. So you get to go home and or go to the mission fair, and then go home. Right? So I was like, sorry, Wayne.
Thank you, Paul.
You were welcome. So again, Wayne emailed me and was saying like, would you mind not having the study on this day so people don't stay home and go to the mission fair. Anyway, so that's kind of my rough roadmap for this. But before we get into Ecclesiastes, this is not like other books of the Bible. And it's not like it because this book does not necessarily contain a lot of hope or a very positive message. And I just want to warn you about that as we get into this. This speaker, Kohelet, is going to say some things that may feel shocking when we sort of strip away our culture's insistence on finding a positive interpretation of a passage of scripture. And he's going to say some stuff that may be disturbing, but it's valuable. Because one of the things that attracts me to this book is that I honestly believe it's one of the most honest books in the entire Bible. I come to it because I find a sense of comfort in finding someone who is talking about life the way that I tend to experience it. He's being very honest about how frustrating and hopeless it can feel at different points in time, while also occasionally saying things like, you know what, the best we can do is to just be happy with our circumstances. And I think that there's a lot of honesty and in sort of an endearing comfort in acknowledging how difficult things can be, which I think is one. Goes. Go ahead and pop that up and then press that button down there. Right here. Just turn that on. It's already recording. And it says it's recording to the cloud, so it should be okay. Okay, we're back. All right, so where were we? Yes, Kohelet, right. Yeah. So who is this book often attributed to? Solomon, right. So fun fact, this is very likely it was very likely written way after Solomon's lifespan, even though this author makes it seem like he is King Solomon or sort of appeals to this idea that he is the wisest king who ever ruled in Jerusalem, and people automatically think that it's Solomon because of that reputation. This was probably written after the exile, just based off of the language that they use. How many of you have ever, like, if back in school, did any of you remember reading like Canterbury Tales or anything by Chaucer?
Troilus and Cressida.
Troilus and Cressida, right? So like, and so those are written sort of in Middle English.
Oh, yes.
Does it sound like modern English?
Oh, no.
No, not at all. Have any of you looked at like the original translations of Beowulf or original versions of Beowulf?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah,
That's far more,
it's even
Yeah,
weirder,
oh, yeah.
which is, that is
So-
old English,
yeah.
but it's still English.
Mhm.
But over thousands of years, the language is transformed into what it is today. So the reason that they place Ecclesiastes as sort of an exile or post-exile book is because of the language. When you look at this book compared to older books of the Bible, the older books have sort of like that Middle English or Old English, like they talk in sort of a fancy way. This is more like, hey guys, what's going on? I'm gonna rap with you here a little bit about the meaningless of life. And it sort of has a different tone. In fact, I read one commentator suggested that the Hebrew sounds a lot more like Aramaic in some places. So, and that is something that would have happened much later in history. So just the nature of the language itself and the fact that they're saying more modern slangy kind of things, at least up to that point, would suggest that this is probably not actually written by Solomon. But the author is writing this in the style of sort of the autobiography of an ancient king. But he's doing some weird stuff with it. Because normally autobiographies of ancient kings are trying to like flex their muscles and say, I'm amazing. I went out and I conquered all these cities, you guys. You should be so impressed with me. But that's not the vibe he has. Instead, he starts out talking about, I am full of wisdom and I had wealth and knowledge and I amassed all this power and it was worthless to me. Which is not something that an ancient king would do when they're bragging. So he's taking that genre and turning it on its head. So that's kind of the vibe that we're beginning with. Is there anything else that you all know about the book of Ecclesiastes? Yeah, Becca.
Well, so my Bible is talking about the Kohelet, and it says, according to this person, hence Kohelet is understood to refer to some kind of officer, a gatherer of an assembly.
Right.
That he's probably one who taught the people and could even be translated as preacher.
Yes. So preacher, teacher, gatherer, master of ceremonies. These might all be valid ways to understand the term Kohelet. Could have also been a pen name. It could have been just like, I don't know, a pseudonym that the author just chose to use. But those are all valid ways to try to read this. It doesn't really mean king.
Yeah.
Doesn't really mean king, even though this is done in sort of the style of a king's autobiography at that time. It doesn't really fit with that. And there are reasons to suspect that this is not a monarch at all, but somebody who is just using the language of the monarchy to lend weight to their argument. And we'll see that as we get deeper into this. So let's dive in. Who would like to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 11 for us, just to get us into this? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're fine, Matt. You can go later. So go ahead, please.
The words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to its place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes round to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ears filled with hearing. What has been is, and what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them.
Great. Okay, first impressions. What are you hearing in this passage? What sticks out to you?
A lacking of serotonin.
Yeah.
Ah,
Basically, everything that's happened already is just gonna keep happening, but there is nothing new under the sun. I mean,
Right.
that's the line that I think everybody kind of knows from this.
Yeah, it's very famous. Like it
Yeah.
shows up a lot in pop culture.
Yeah.
My favorite part is the earth remains forever.
Mhm.
I like that.
Well,
Yeah.
Mhm. Go ahead, Bruce.
well, it just seems to strike a life, at least to the extent of human life, is meaningless.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, so if you look at verse 2,
Mhm.
there's this word that he uses that's gonna, like, so nothing new under the sun, that's gonna follow us around for a little, that pops up a few times. But the word that really seems to come up again and again and again, vanity of vanities.
Yeah.
This is the Hebrew word hebel. And again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right or wrong, you can fact check me on that later if you'd like, but there are a couple different ways to translate this. So we may be working with a couple different translations around the room.
My translation says meaningless.
Meaningless, right, meaninglessness.
And if you follow along, it goes, everything is meaningless. And then another heading is wisdom is meaningless. Another one is pleasures are meaningless. Wisdom and folly are meaningless. Richness is meaningless. It's like, wow, this is a theme in here. Wow.
Yes, it is.
Advancement is meaningless.
That's right, yeah, no. Mhm.
Hey,
So we hear meaningless, vanity, what else do we have? Does anybody have anything slightly different? I mean, if we're only working in certain translations too, it might actually end up being one of those two. Just checking.
ooh, it says,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, I'm trying to think, oh, it says, other words are useless, hollow, futile, vain.
Yes, vain, hollow, useless, futile. So I've been using Peter Enns' commentary on Ecclesiastes, and this is a great resource if any of you ever want to go dig. You don't need to buy it for this particular thing. I'm going to be kind of just giving you stuff that I think is interesting from it. But he spent a lot of time sort of collating what other scholars have said about it. And he thinks maybe the most accurate translation, at least for our understanding in English, is sort of a combination for all of those terms with the word absurd. So if you look at those verses, two would be absurdity upon absurdity, says the teacher, absurdity upon absurdity, all is absurd. So there's not just this idea of it being sort of vain or purposeless or meaningless, but there's a sense of humor kind of mixed into this a little bit too. Because I mean, when you think about absurdist humor, what pops to mind? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which purest absurdist humor in its finest, because the Python boys in particular spent a lot of time really focusing on the pointlessness and meaninglessness of life. And in some ways that sort of fits very nicely with the vibe that we're going to get here when we read through Ecclesiastes, because that's what he's trying to dismantle. These first 11 verses are also a really, really good summary of the entire book. Verses 1 through 11 in chapter 1 overlap really heavily with the last set of verses in the book. And some commentators call this the frame narrator's setup of the entire thing. And let's just take a very quick look. If you flip all the way to the end.
Well, that's like English writing
Yeah.
101.
Right.
Present your argument and then.
Yeah,
sign it.
exactly.
Uh-huh.
If you look at verses 9 through 14, this is sort of the conclusion that the frame narrator uses here to sort of summarize everything that's been done at the beginning of the book and then again at the end of the book. Who wants to read 9 through 14
I
for
can
us?
do that.
Go ahead, Becca.
Besides being wise, the teacher also taught people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs. The teacher sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote words of truth plainly. The sayings of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, For that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil.
So what's interesting about the way that the frame narrator closes this book, sort of like this little cap or this bookend, he's basically saying, here are all, so in chapter 1 through 11, the narrator is saying, hey, get ready, you're about to read a serotonin deficient book that is going to be quite heavy. But at the end of it, the frame narrator then comes back in and he doesn't refute anything that the book said. In fact, he warns you, if anything beyond these, my child, beware. He's like, don't, but what that basically means is don't add anything or take anything away from this book. Anybody else know another book that says that or has a warning like that at the end? Revelation. So right there, that puts Ecclesiastes in weird company. So now, in some ways, the narrator at the end here is trying to kind of add a positive note to the end of things, right? But at the same time, he's also not negating everything that's about to come. One of the things that I think is really beautiful about this book is it stares into the void and it really confronts it. And it doesn't necessarily try to make it okay, but it also sort of goes, you know what, even in the midst of all of this, God is still good, which I think is incredibly valuable given especially our daily experiences in life. For people who struggle with depression, right? There's still a place for God to speak to us in the midst of that. And again, wrestling with depression is an excellent way to explain the mechanics of Ecclesiastes. I think that it really fits that vibe. Are there any other thoughts on these first 11 verses? Is there anything else that sticks out to you about these?
You know, I would.
Go ahead, Wayne.
Make a comment.
Sure.
I read this sometime in the last year. You know, I don't remember that much about it, but you know, you get gripped by the kind of the ethos of it, the feeling and tone of it. And it was at a time when Gaza and Ukraine and all these wars just
Right.
bore down on me, I remember. And at the same time, I remember writing a list of questions I had theologically and not having any answers particularly. And I suppose the last few verses were sort of that little upbeat
Right.
in the midst of that, you know, because whatever God is enough. Whatever salvation is enough.
Right.
Whatever sin is, it's here to deal with it.
Right.
You know, so I mean, it's kind of like, let some of this stuff go.
Right.
And it doesn't make all the problems go away,
No.
particularly, but just take a breath.
Yeah, that's good.
I really like this book.
Yeah.
I really do.
Me too.
And
Oh, we're gonna start a cult here.
yeah, what I like in verses 1 through 11 is that the author is connecting the rhythms of our lives and deaths to the rhythms of nature.
Yeah.
And just.
Yes, yeah, and there's a lot of that kind of language throughout the book, and that's something that I really value. It's also one of the only books that actually potentially talks about what happens to animals when they die, which I think is great. Especially being somebody who has lost pets that I care about very deeply. So, and I thought that was really valuable. We'll touch on that when we get to it. Yes, Bruce.
For me, one of the stark things that, the impression I get when I read this is it's a grand leveling.
Yes.
That there, you know, these hierarchies, these things, I strive to be,
Mhm.
well, when you look at the breadth of existence. It's plainer, it flattens out.
Correct.
The lowest of the low and the highest of the high are really
Yes.
on the same plane when it comes to human existence.
Absolutely.
And
And that,
experience.
and if you've only read this once and you forgot a lot about it, and if that appeals to you, you're gonna love what he has to say coming up next. Because that flattening of the hierarchy in the face of mortality is the central problem of the book. And that's really what Kohelet's upset about. And we're gonna see that, especially as we get into this next section here. Death is the thing that really bothers Kohelet. Why do we die? And really, in the face of life, in the face of mortality, how do we construct meaning and purpose to anything that we do? If rich and poor and wise and foolish alike all die. And that's what ultimately flattens that hierarchy. And we'll see the mechanics of that unpack themselves over the next few verses. Good anticipation of where we're going. Golden star, Bruce. Very good. Okay. Any other quick thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking in these last couple of verses that it's
Mhm.
also saying that from generation to generation, the lesson's gonna be the same.
Yes,
It's not gonna change.
correct. Yes. And that line in there about the earth continuing, the earth remaining forever is not necessarily supposed to be a reassuring thing. It's sort of like, if you look at the way that the verse is constructed, a generation goes, a generation comes. And you notice he starts with leaving and then concludes with coming in that pair. Instead of saying a generation comes, then a generation goes.
Yeah.
You say a generation dies off, a new one shows up, the earth remains, nothing ends up changing, the problem stays the exact same. We all inherit this issue of wrestling with meaning in the face of death, which is both reassuring and deeply troubling at the exact same time. Let's take a look to keep us on time here, because I know you all are going to have questions about these next few. Let's take a look at verses 1:12 through 18. Or sorry, I should say chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. Who would like to read those for us? Who wants to share? Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got the NIV, so it'll be a little different.
Oh, yeah.
I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief.
Okay, vibe check. How are we doing?
It's good. It's interesting that it's with much wisdom comes much sorrow, because mine says vexation.
Yes.
Which I think of as a completely different emotion.
Yes.
Sorrow is sadness and vexation is like.
Yes. So when,
Exasperation.
so one of the, Peter Inns actually chimed in on that one. So, he says that the word is better translated as anger.
Oh, okay.
Anger instead of, but I think that there's room for sorrow. I think that there's room for grief being part of that. But so, I mean, if you really think about that, so in much wisdom is much anger. Is that does that ring true?
It reminds me of an
Okay.
interview I saw of First Blood, Stallone.
Okay, yeah.
Sylvester Stallone, and he said he has seen life from very poor to very rich. And he said the happiest people are in the middle.
Mhm.
The very poor are unhappy because they lack resources.
Mhm.
The very rich are unhappy because they've seen the top end of human existence
Mhm.
and it's got a ceiling.
Yeah.
And I think this speaks to that. I think that it doesn't just keep growing exponentially.
Right.
There's a point of human experience, of human pleasure, of human engagement that outside of love, I guess I would say, I would, carefully caveat that. It's not gonna get any better.
Hmm.
It's kind of like the fix of an addict.
Mhm.
That first time was wonderful. You'll never get it again, but you'll be chasing it. And I think that is a very common thing for people who reach that high end, that there is a limit, there's a ceiling. And it can be very depressing.
Yeah.
Well, isn't there possibly a point at which wisdom can lead to transcendence? And then, maybe for some people.
Mhm.
So it's not really all vexation.
So that's a really great question. So let's keep that specific point in mind, the idea that wisdom leads to transcendence, that it's got a net good at the end. While we look at the claims he is making here, what kind of person does he sound like to you?
Frustrated.
Frustrated? Okay, good. Go ahead, Becca.
Well, I don't know, I'm still thinking, go ahead.
Yeah, so let me put it to you in a different way. If you have someone who says, I have acquired great wisdom surpassing everybody who has ever come before me. My mind has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. How would you think, what would you think of that person if they started making claims like that? Maybe
If they were
possibly
vain.
vain, arrogant.
Yeah.
Scholarly.
Potentially, yes, scholarly. So with this claim, I think that the text invites us to take it at face value in some ways. That this teacher is saying, look, I have done my homework. I am actually wise. I have acquired more wisdom and knowledge than anybody else. And for me, this is still a hopeless endeavor. What he's doing is specifically in this passage here, and with that claim that wisdom increases vexation, is he's outright denying the idea that wisdom leads to enlightenment.
Yeah.
He's just flatly contradicting it.
That could be another path.
There could be or he's maybe saying that there is no
There's no
path.
there is no path. And this is where, again, our tendency is to take something that's in the Bible and to try to make it positive. And I'm going to ask all of you to let that go as we do this, because that's not really what he's getting at. Right? He wants us to see the cyclical end of life. And he wants us to see that even if you have wisdom or wealth, which is actually the next passage that comes up when he starts talking about his gigantic quest for pleasure and things, right? Even in there, it still ends up hitting the ceiling. There's still something that we can't get past, and it's the fact that we die, right?
What dawns on me though is, I caveat that with for personal pursuit.
Right.
Now, you think of the truly happy ones are the ones who are thinking about others.
Mhm.
Whose life experience is not about them
Right.
achieving wealth or achieving pleasure,
Mhm.
but assisting others in
Right.
achieving an
Yes.
elevated standard of living.
And again, there's a lot of social science research that backs that up too.
Yeah.
But also like from an ignorance standpoint, I mean, ignorance is bliss, right? So there's a number of people who, because they don't wanna look at
Mhm.
the challenges of other people outside of their circle, are quite happy in their circle.
Yeah.
But if you seek out and understand what other people go through and other experiences other people have, that feeling of happiness can sometimes go away because you realize what's really out there.
Right.
So I don't know what that's supposed to say, but.
But that's gonna vary from individual to individual, depending on how they view their life.
Right, I'm just saying there are a number
Yeah,
of people
yeah,
who would
right.
say that their world is a happy world, but
Sure.
part of it's because they never look outside of their world.
Right.
Right. Yeah,
But
that's
then there
very
are
true.
gonna be those that are gonna look at those outside their circle and say, either they're gonna find the one thing that they think is so great for them,
Mhm.
or they're gonna look back and say, okay, well, where I'm at is a lot better than where they're at. Or, you know, there's so many different ways of perceiving it,
Right.
that it depends on the individual.
Well, again, I think that what Kohelet would say is, even with that being the case, even those individuals are gonna hit a limit.
Yeah.
Like, there's gonna be a place where, again, because everybody hits the limit that he's talking about, which is the fact that we die. So Peter Enns has some interesting things to say specifically about this setup of his quest for wisdom here. With such a start, one would expect a more positive line of argumentation than what we see at the end of verse 17, right? Having just told us how much wiser he is than any of his predecessors and how thorough his investigation will be. In other words, having set the reader up for the expectation of something good to come from all of this, Kohelet drops another bomb. I know that this too is a chasing after the wind. And what is this he's referring to? It's not wisdom itself, but the entire quest that he outlines in verses 16 and 17. To paraphrase Kohelet's words, since I am more wise than any king as there ever was in Jerusalem, I will apply myself to the quest of knowing wisdom and folly and the difference between them. But even for me, this is a futile quest.
Well, so back to verse 13.
Mhm.
It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings.
Correct.
I see that.
Correct. And that should not escape anybody's notice. Who did this to us? God. And that's gonna be something that we're going to deal with. So like, if you look at Job, like, so the other books in wisdom literature that we've got, which are gonna typically include Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and I think sometimes Song of Solomon's lumped into there as well. Job is one of those books that actually spends a lot of time asking questions of God, right? And comes to some sort of resolution at the end. Even in the Psalms, you see complaint Psalms where it's like, God, why does my life suck? Oh, but you are still good. And it usually has that in at the end of it. And Ecclesiastes is kind of picking up that question of, God, why does life suck? And it just sort of stops there. And we'll see that we'll get into this as we kind of allow this to unravel. But I mean, make no mistake, he is very much directing blame at God here with this, or at least, if not outright blame, responsibility is being laid at God's
Maybe
feet.
responsibility too.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Well, let's make it worse. Let's take a look. So wisdom that makes you angry. What about having a good time? Let's take a look at chapter 2. So let's look at verses 1 through 11. Who's got those for us? And why is it Wayne Brown?
I said to myself, come now, I will make a test of pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But again, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I search with my mind how to cheer my body with wine, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold of folly, until I might see what was good for mortals to do under the heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted them in all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I brought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any other who had been before me in Jerusalem. Sounds like Trump. I also
Marvelous. Wayne said it and I didn't. Okay, please continue, Wayne.
Verse 8.
Yeah, thank you. How far am I going? Till
11. Please and thank you.
All right. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasures of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and delights of the flesh and many concubines. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it, and again, all is vanity, and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun.
Mhm. So couple fun facts. So I heard you all chuckling when we got to verse 3 and where it says, I searched with my mind how to cheer my body with wine. And the wine, my mind still guiding me with wisdom, made some of you chuckle. Why?
Just doing it as an experiment.
It's the combination of wisdom and wine that,
Yeah.
there's a point at which it blurs.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like he's not, it sounds like he's sort of saying, well, I'm being wise while I'm out getting wasted, right? And
Yeah,
we
well,
can do
and
that,
like
yeah.
my mind is guiding me, so I'm like, oh, I'm doing this because it's part of this mental, like,
Right.
exercise to
Yeah.
do this, you know,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, right, and you know, it just sounds like an excuse to drink to us, correct?
Yeah.
Careful with that. I would say, and again, to be clear here, again, one of my favorite parts of this commentary was, no, it wasn't that he just like went to a wine tasting and just had a few glasses. No, according to the context, he outright just got smashed and partied as hard as he possibly could, if we're kind of taking his quest at face value. But there's a method to this. He's doing this intentionally, right? And yeah, he's probably having a great time while he's doing it, sure, but this is part of the experiment. This is part of the enterprise that he's trying to explore. So we do have to give him like at least a point there. He's trying to remind himself that this is the overall goal. I'm trying to understand what is there for us to enjoy in the world. Okay, so did it work?
So some of the words that followed were probably during the course of his hangover.
Possibly. Yeah. Right, well, and although like he goes out and he parties really hard, then he's like, you know what I wanna do is I wanna plant a vineyard, and like, really, like he immediately starts coming to
Yeah.
build, but again. You hang out up in bars and you see people start make plans like that when they've had too much to drink. So yeah, but then he immediately turns around and starts building and buying and developing infrastructure and, you know, marrying wives, finding concubines, basically abducting and recruiting slaves. I mean, there's a lot, but which I guess is the version of starting a business, right?
Yeah.
Those are the ancient version of starting a business. So I mean, he went out and he did quite a bit. Did it work?
Well, what is he trying to change?
So, great question. Let's look at the last verse here in verse 11, where it says, there is nothing to be gained under the sun. So there are two words here in the Hebrew that are really, really, really interesting. So Yitron is the word here, and I know I'm butchering it. So it's a word that means profit or gain. It's something that it's an economic term. And that's one of the reasons that they date this later than other people might claim, or the traditional dating might claim. Yitron is an economic idea that would have been developed around the time of Babylon, where you obtain something that you get to hold on to. You have a gain or a profit from some kind of endeavor that's not necessarily going to be taken away from you. And we contrast this with something called Helic. And Helic is sort of what's allotted to us, what we're given to do at a certain time in our life. Like we live in Port Angeles, like there's kind of what we've been given, and it can be a temporary thing for some of us. Or like, you know, I have a job right now. That's great. Does it mean that I'm going to have that job forever? Well, no, because I'm probably going to retire at some point, right? Or I have my health, and that's a transitory thing. It could go away at any moment. Does that make sense? So Helek is stuff that's more temporary. Yitron is something that we kind of keep that profits us or gives us gain. So when he's complaining about there is nothing to be gained under the sun, he's using Yitron. There's no profit or thing that we keep. It goes away. It's all Helek instead. It passes, it slips through our fingers. It's only ever temporary. So some of the language about it being wind and vanity, the fact that it's not temporary, that it's only temporary, that it's not permanent, really sinks in here. Does that help a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
They didn't
fantastic.
have social security back then.
Nope, but even that's Hellic, because that's a situation you find yourself in. It's not something that you end up getting to keep. Yeah, and it may go away. So that's true. So let's take a look, and again, I'm monitoring our time here, and I want to make sure there's plenty of room to discuss this last section, because this is where he really hits the core of his argument. Who would like to read verses 12 through 26 for us? A bit of a long passage, but valuable. Pam, did you get voluntold?
Apparently,
Oh,
apparently.
no, I'm so sorry. this is the hellic that you find yourself in.
Apparently.
Go ahead.
Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I thought in my heart, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? And I said in my heart, this too is meaningless. For the wise man, like the fool, will not be long remembered. In days to come, both will be forgotten. Like the fool, the wise man too must die. So I hated my life, because the work that I had done underneath the sun was grievous to me, and all of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me, and one who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the work until I have poured my efforts and skill underneath the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor underneath the sun. For a man may do his work with his wisdom, knowing skill. A man will do his work with wisdom and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone else who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with every labor he has underneath the sun? All his days, his work, his pain and grief, even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
Woo! This is where he gets into his central problem. I have studied and I have been wise. I have built all of these things. I have all of these slaves. I have all these concubines. I have worked really, really hard. What's gonna happen to all of it?
Somebody else.
Yeah.
Can't take it with you.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have any of you, and I want to remind you, you were on camera and you are being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So I'm going to, I'll invite you to edit your response to protect the innocent. But how many of you have seen children inherit something from their parents and then waste it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So is his fear unfounded then?
No.
Not at all. Oh, not at all. There's a lot to unpack in this block here because this gets us where he wants us to be. He's sort of moving us into position for the next cycle of arguments that he makes over the next few chapters. So let's really look at this closely here. So he concludes, are you surprised by his reactions or the conclusions he's drawing at all? Like, is this shocking or sort of like, I can't believe he's saying this to anyone?
No.
No.
Oh,
I think between the wine and the sun, it's to be expected.
okay, all right, so maybe like, again, so this is going back to the hangover hypothesis a little bit. That, you know, maybe he's.
That
Yeah.
along with the effects of too much sun
Okay,
and just some of the crazy thoughts that come with
okay,
with the wine and the sun.
so he's working too hard, he's had too much to drink, yeah,
Working too
okay.
hard, probably not getting enough sleep, probably not eating properly, you know, there's all these things.
Okay, so we're gonna attribute this to basically his deteriorating mental health. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So, all right, so any other reactions?
Well, it seems to me that. You know, again, my model of flattening things out,
Right.
he's got a very expansive viewpoint on
Mhm.
life. And cutting to the chase, well, if at the end we all die, what does it matter?
Right.
Okay, maybe he's not saying that directly, but if I was to nutshell it, that's what I would say he's saying.
Mhm.
And yet we live in our lives. Does that mean we should be miserable? You know, when we listen to
Right.
Jesus in 5th chapter of Matthew, give the Sermon on the Mountain, we learn that, oh man, we can't possibly measure up.
Mhm.
What's going on there? It's just kind of telling us overall on the macro level, this is the human condition.
Mhm.
We are powerless when it comes to having any great effect, when it comes to being great. All the things that in our little day-to-day lives, we kind of strive for, we toil for,
Mhm.
and at the end of it, it lacks meaning in and of itself unless meaning is ascribed to it by our maker. So I may have just fell off the rail a little bit there, but I guess my point is, part of me wants to say, well, so what?
Mhm.
I have my life to live.
Mhm.
And I can
Is it-
still be
well,
happy in
is-
this miserable, meaningless existence.
But is he kind of saying that in verses 24 through 26?
There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. Well, yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know about,
This also I saw is from the hand of God, so, yeah.
I messed up with the eating and drinking part, so there's other ways of
Yeah.
finding enjoyment.
Right, but,
Yeah.
right, because he's sort of talking about sort of daily pleasures. You made a noise like you forgot what it was, okay.
Well, I think of down the street from me, there was a man who had this beautiful vegetable garden. He spent hours on it and he supplied the neighborhood with vegetables and it was his pride and joy. And he gave me starts from his raspberries, which I still have, and then he died.
Mhm.
And his family said, that's too much work. They plowed it all in and now it's just the grass. And when I pass his yard and I see the grass and I think of Mr. Gus Bennett, who used to have this wonderful garden, and it's like, you know, it was like his kids inherited it and went, nothing to me, plow it through, you know, and I went, ah. Because that was so important to him and,
Yeah.
but it was not to them.
Right.
And so it's like, you know, you think about what's important to you and, you know,
Oh, yeah.
kids are gonna inherit it and it may not be important to them, they can trash it. You know, it's like,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, have any of you had that experience of cleaning out like a parent's house
Mhm.
after they pass?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
a couple of times,
Mhm.
yeah.
And what happened to most of that stuff?
It's not.
It went in a multitude of different directions.
Okay.
Some of the kids would take some of it, but very little,
Yeah,
only those little things that meant something to them.
yeah,
Generally. Some of it went out to the curb,
yeah.
some of it went to Goodwill, some of it went in the trash.
Yeah. My great grandfather collected these porcelain mustache cups. Now, hang on. A mustache cup, just in case you do not know what that is basically a teacup that has a little porcelain strip in the middle of it. So when you drink, it keeps your mustache dry. So when he died, he passed this massive collection of mustache cups to my poor uncle, who still has them and very much does not want them at all. Like, oh no, like we took the furniture that Papa Steve made, yeah, we were happy to receive that. I still have his woodworking bench had this chair. So I inherited that from him somehow, and I still have that chair in my kitchen. And I still use it from time to time when I'm prepping and cooking, because like that's what he used it for, was doing something that he was good at with his hands. And when I cook, I kind of feel a connection with him that way. The mustache cups, like nobody wanted these, and he really loved them. So my Uncle Rick threatens us with these mustache cups. And he says, if you just send me your address, I'm just gonna mail you a mustache cup. And like, we're waiting for the day for them to just slowly start showing up like one at a time. But when we get them, what am I gonna do with them? I have no idea. Who on earth wants a mustache cup?
bet if you put them on eBay or
I know.
I know, that's what I thought. Maybe there's some you thrown to gain from that.
He already
But
looked.
I already looked and they're worthless. They're worthless.
There's too many people who are also in the same
Right.
situation.
So I'm sure you all have something that you love, that you really, really value, that no one else is gonna want.
Well, just like your parents' silver and china and all.
Yeah.
that.
Nobody, the kids don't want it.
Oh, no, especially for people in our generation, there's this ongoing conversation about what do we do with the China? Because we already have ours, we never use it.
Exactly.
So when we inherit stuff from our folks, you, like Goodwill, at a certain point,
Goodwill.
as older generations die off, it's gonna be choked with very, very nice China sets that they paid a lot of money for.
Yeah,
So if you want good China, maybe go check that out, because I guarantee it's already happening.
well, go walk through Goodwill sometime.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
there's all kinds of amazing things in there.
Yeah.
Well, I think that many people struggle with this existential question
Yes,
sometime in their lives. And so it's very relatable,
yeah,
just to be reading it.
Mhm.
absolutely. Oh, and that's really the core of existential philosophy in general, is where do we go from our mortality? Like, how do we grapple with the fact that, like, all the stuff that I'm doing, you know, the people who, like, my nieces and my nephews are probably not gonna really care a whole lot about my Star Wars collection, right? Like, what are they gonna do with it? They're probably gonna go, well, maybe Audrey will. Audrey, if you were watching this, talk about this later. So. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not gonna be around to see what happens to it.
So how do I take verse 18 and verse 24?
Uh,
Are they amendments, are they kind of contradictory? So I hated all my toil.
Yes.
Which I had toiled.
Under the sun.
24, there's nothing better for mortals to do than eat, drink, and find enjoyment in their toil. So
No
what's,
contradiction there.
okay, help me out.
The best that I can get is something that I hate.
Ooh,
Ecclesiastes. This is just the vibe. Now, the other thing that I would point out is there are contradictions in the book, and you could interpret this as a valid contradiction. Given his super negative vibes, though, I would say he may not be contradicting himself. He might be, well, I hate this, but it's the best that I've got, so bottoms up, I guess. And let's go out for lunch, right? So,
the best I've got is also from God.
right,
It's the worst I've got.
correct.
Interesting.
And again, so when he says this is also from the hand of God, that's not necessarily him saying, oh, thank you, God. It's more
Because he
like
just said God was responsible.
God was
for this
responsible for this awful situation.
Yeah.
Hey, the best we can do is eat and drink. That's also God's fault. Ecclesiastes. So let me take a look at something else here, specifically around when we look at verse, verse 14, I perceive that the same fate befalls all of them. And then in 15, I said to myself, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. So why have I been so very good and wise? Why have I wasted my time being good? Peter Enns has some useful insight on this. Beginning in these passages and going through verse 17 is Kohelet's first explicit reference to death's role as driving the breakdown of meaning hinted at in 1 verse 11. As such, it forms a very handy summary of the book as a whole. Whatever haggling we do about what is of meaning or importance and value in this life must face the fact that it is only for this life that this thing or this decision has any significance. The universality of death ultimately and incontestably renders all things known. Note that in verse 15, his fate is no different from that of the fool, an idea that stands in contrast to the thought expressed in the previous verse. Indeed, this observation leads Kohelet to the question of the value of being too wise, and that's a thought he will revisit in a later chapter. The reason death neutralizes the benefits of wisdom is expressed in verse 16. Neither the wise nor the fool is ever remembered. And this is a theme that goes on forward because at that time, the idea of an afterlife wasn't something that was more fleshed out until a little bit after the exile. So in ancient Jewish thought, you live on in the memories of people who knew you and who cared about you. But when they die, those memories fade too. So he's still taking that to its logical conclusion.
You know,
Go ahead, Wayne.
there was maybe it was a song
Mhm.
or just a thought that was prevalent in my growing up where I get to go something like only what's done for Christ will last.
Right.
And, so I mean, so there are, I mean, if you, I guess there's the eternity aspect of that, I suppose. but
Right.
There's also the stone in the pond and the ripples that go out from what
Yes.
that is done.
Correct.
that Then affect somebody else that goes on, that
Right.
goes on. So there is a kind of spiritual legacy, I would hope.
Right, and well, and
Why are we even here? That's
Correct. for Kohelet, death is the final equalizer, and it's sort of death gets the last word. Does death get the last word for us?
No,
No.
it's been dealt with.
It's, well, correct. So then this, if you are reading Ecclesiastes and you get too bummed out, and it's okay if that happens, that this book can be harsh sometimes. But may I remind you that we are looking at this from the vantage point of the crucifixion and the resurrection. We are looking backwards on this, right? Kohelet's in the thick of it. Kohelet doesn't see the cross. Kohelet is, what do I do with this? Like, where is this going? If this all ends in death, and we have a very different perspective on that. So if you are finding yourself as we go through these next few weeks, but not next week because of the mission fair, as we go through this, if it weighs on your soul and makes you really go, oh man, what is the point of any of this? I want you to look at the cross, and not just the cross, but the empty tomb. Because for us, death is not the final word. This, however, does not invalidate the value or the truth in what Kohelet is saying. Because for even with the resurrected Christ by our side, is life easy? No. And that's a pretty good place for us to end this week, because it's only a slightly positive vibe, which that's what we're working on. So, because I think, I know a few of you have to get going here and get ready for the next service. Matt, would you like to close us in prayer?
Lord God, as we go from this place, may we continue to wrestle with the propositions that Kohelet offers to us. That we could peer into the depths, holding on to the knowledge of what we have in Christ. But look at how this applies to so much of life around us. We can find our place and hold on to that in you. So give you thanks for our discussion today. Pray your blessing as we go. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Next session, I think we all need